Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Welsh, Director of the CSIS Global Food Security Program. In partnership with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization's Liaison Office in Washington, CSIS welcomes you to our online event, A New Era for Climate Change and Food Security. We decided to host this event in light of heightened attention to climate change, both within the Biden administration, evidenced by President Biden's January 27th executive order and last month's Leaders Summit on Climate, among many other things, and globally within the UN climate change, with the UN Climate Change Conference set for later this year, and significant attention to climate change in several major multilateral events. Likewise, there remains significant attention to the relationship between climate change and food security. For example, the UN FAO and partners recently released a first ever report on climate change and food systems, finding that food systems account for more than 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, climate change is disrupting livelihood for those engaged in farming, herding, forestry, and fishing worldwide, with Vice President Harris recently naming food insecurity among the factors contributing to the surge of migration from Central America to the United States. We framed the title of our event not as a statement, but as a question. Will the political events of this year make a difference, or are they merely rhetoric? Will they push producers to cut emissions and help them adapt? Will they help all consumers make wiser decisions? To help us answer these questions, I'm very excited to have assembled an expert panel, including Anne Vaughn, Senior Advisor for Climate Change in USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. Anne is joining us from Washington. Zituni Old-Dada, Deputy Director of the UN FAO's Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity, and Environment, joining us from London. And Helga Flores Trejo, Vice President for Global Public Affairs and International Organizations at Bayer. And Helga is joining us from Washington as well. Before we begin, I'd like to turn to our event's co-host, Vimlendra Sharan. Over to you, Vimlendra.
Thank you, Caitlin, and a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our listeners from whichever part of the globe you're joining in. First and foremost, huge thank you to CSIS, to Caitlin and her team at CSIS for joining hands and bringing together this group of very eminent speakers and panelists who will, of course, not only give us a flavor of what a country perspective from a country as important and as big as United States of America is to these issues, but will also give us a global perspective from what FAO sees around the world on issues governing climate change and its impact on food security and nutrition. We also will obviously hear a private sector perspective, a group, a sector which is becoming increasingly important as days go by in the huge role that it has to play in both combating and adapting to climate change issues. Climate as it affects food security and agriculture and nutrition, these are pretty well-established facts, pretty scientifically, pretty well known now around the world. What has been lacking perhaps is the real political will and push to take this forward in terms of commitments, and more than in terms of commitments, I would say more in terms of the financial backing required for those commitments to really go through. In that perspective, what President Biden has done in calling together the Leaders Summit, where 17 of the world's leading economies and around 40 odd leaders came together to discuss issues going forward and how to take the Paris commitments a step up and go beyond all that to ensure that we do limit the temperature rise that is threatening the world, especially agriculture and food. So in that light, we thought that it would be really pertinent to see where we are going from here, especially in a global perspective, especially now that US is firmly back into the whole mix of things, back into the Paris Agreement, and back into trying and taking the leadership role and moving the world forward. Climate change, we all know, is a huge threat multiplier for the hungry and undernourished of the world. And sadly, but it is also the highly vulnerable countries which also become vulnerable in other senses of conflict, etc., which have also become climate hotspots and are finding it very difficult to move ahead in food production and availability and access and all other aspects of the food chain, whether it be the utilization or stability of the food systems. So it's extremely important for us to understand that extreme weather-related disasters are increasing, and they are having a major impact on crop production and productivity. And the high CO2 levels in turn impact a big deal on crop nutrition. So keeping all these issues in mind, it will be really very engrossing and a very educative 1 hour from now when we hear Anne and Zetonii and Helga give us their perspectives on what the whole scenario looks like and where we are to go from here and what really is needed, what are the solutions on board and what more needs to be done. So I'll stop here because I'm very excited to listen to these perspectives, and I'll hand back to Caitlin to take the proceeds forward.
Thank you very much, Vinlendra, for that framing. For a brief keynote address to start off our event, I'd like to turn to Anne Vaughn, Senior Advisor for Climate Change in USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. Anne, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Caitlin, CSIS, Vinlendra, and FAO. Really appreciate you convening this event. It's a great panel and on such an important and timely topic. I think I can answer the question about if this is a new era for climate change and food security in only 2 words. It would be yes and. Yes, the US is again exercising global leadership on climate change that opens up a whole new era of possibilities, and we can build off very strong foundation of numerous US government efforts like Feed the Future, Water for the World, US programming in resilience, adaptation, natural climate solutions, biodiversity, and land and resource governance. These efforts are advancing food security and nutrition, feeding a growing number of people on a hotter planet while improving access to nutritious foods and supporting countries' efforts to reduce emissions. So just in brief remarks, I'd like to highlight the urgency to act, steps the USG is taking or already taken to ramp up its contributions to the fight against climate change, and then climate in relation to the global food security strategy, because I think that brings together the theme of the panel today. But first, just to share a bit of background. So as Caitlin said, I'm the Senior Advisor for Climate Change in the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security at USAID. There are a lot of other parts of USAID that are doing great work on climate and the environment. And I'm sort of speaking from my perch at RFS. Although I have to say, and it's been really exciting coming on board with USAID in just the last 2 months or 3 months, is the cooperation, coordination, and enthusiasm across the agency for engaging on climate is widespread, and it's been exciting to see the energy and enthusiasm that everybody across the board is showing in ramping up our action on climate. But specifically at RFS, we're focused on ending hunger, poverty, malnutrition, and water insecurity while strengthening resilience. And we do this through a few key initiatives and legislation like Feed the Future, US government's initiative to end global hunger, the Global Water Strategy, and the agency-wide Global Nutrition Coordination Plan. And with our ongoing and growing focus on climate, we're making sure that all of these sectors are embedding a climate angle. So what that means is the wonky speak for we're mainstreaming climate across everything we do to reduce risk, including with a special focus on agriculture. And we know there's certainly some urgency to act. As President Biden's executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad has stated, domestic action must go hand in hand with US international leadership aimed at significantly enhancing global action. Together, we must listen to science and meet the moment. I think you can look over the past 100+ days and know there's been a lot going on. Besides joining Paris, There's been a slew of executive orders that we've been working on implementing, and we're taking these directives from the president very seriously and with great urgency. And in many parts that we have to as part of our day job too, as the impacts of climate change are being felt by populations across the globe now and in communities and countries we're working in. Countries are seeing longer droughts, more erratic weather, and more frequent and extreme weather events. It directly impacts agriculture, water availability, erodes household and community resilience, and can have lasting impacts on nutrition outcomes. So this means that already fragile food and water systems that are already challenged by COVID and are stressed now more than ever. And as noted just a minute ago, smallholder farmers who depend on their land for their livelihoods are some of the groups that are most at risk. Terrifyingly, temperature increases are likely to reduce ag yields of critical food crops from about 5 to 30%, right around the corner between 2030 and 2050. And as a result, farmers are trapped in a cycle of poverty, hunger, and malnutrition, and it's limiting their community's access to safe, affordable, nutritious food. And in less than 30 years, up to 3 billion more people could face water scarcity. This would further compromise food security as well as public health and economic growth. Ironically, agriculture in many of these hard-hit countries can also drive tropical deforestation. And to reach that 1.5-degree target set out in the Paris Agreement, this deforestation has to stop. USAID has longstanding programs to support our developing country partners in large-scale land use planning, climate finance, and policy development to reduce the pressure agriculture places on these carbon-dense landscapes and help farmers increase their crop yields with the land assets that they have. So as noted, we've already joined Paris, issued a variety of executive orders, and it really increased our climate and action. We had the Climate Leaders Summit 2 weeks ago, and the president's speech even last week. You can tell the Biden-Harris administration is prioritizing action on climate change and elevating that political will mentioned earlier. The administration is seeking to work with partners around the globe to make up for the lost time, maximize progress, raise our collective ambition to meet the climate challenges. And we know USAID plays a key role in the Biden-Harris administration's bold climate efforts by working with partner countries to reduce emissions, sustainably develop their economies, and increase climate resilience. With about a quarter of emissions caused by deforestation, land degradation, and ag, we're working to help partner countries advance natural climate solutions. This includes reducing emissions and capturing carbon by combating deforestation, improving conservation of carbon-rich forests and landscapes, while also improving the ability of safe and nutritious food, water security, jobs, and increasing resilience. We're also playing a leading role for the US government in enhancing equitable climate resilience for the most vulnerable, as climate justice is also a key cornerstone of our work. USAID helps partner countries strengthen their capacities to better manage climate and disaster risk, maintaining global food and water security. It's preventing the spread of vector-borne diseases, fostering inclusive growth, and reducing conflict over resources in the face of the changing climate. We're also the lead coordinator for federal agency coordinator for responding to international climate-related disasters, which we know are increasing. So we've got a strong record already working on climate that we want to and are strengthening even further. And we're excited that to also announce at the summit 2 weeks ago, we are developing a climate change strategy that will release at COP26 later this year. The strategy will look at all sectors, reflecting USAID's commitment to identify and act on opportunities to support our country partners to adapt to climate change, reduce emissions across a full set of development programs. And we greatly welcome thoughts and engagements on what this strategy can and should do to meet the challenges we face and solidify this new era for action that we're talking about today. We're specifically responding also right now outside of the climate change strategy to 3 executive orders that's helping us further mainstream climate into our programming and strategies and policies. So we're really busy on the climate front, which is obviously closely linked to food security, as climate change both requires rapid adaptation and support for mitigation, including climate smart agriculture, which increases yields and seeks to adapt and mitigate. So we have a lot to build on in our food security work, luckily. So just a couple highlights because we're proud of this effort. Last year, Feed the Future celebrated its 10th anniversary. Since the start of this initiative, Feed the Future lifted 23.4 million people above the poverty line, helped over 3 million children live free of stunting, and unlocked $3.5 billion in financing for food security. And then speaking about sort of the resilience of food systems and that is so needed to deal with shocks and stresses, our ongoing relationship with partners and host countries and the private sector and civil society to scale appropriate technologies is help meeting urgent challenges, including how we've responded to COVID response, including how we're engaging on COVID and helping with the response and recovery. And it's important to keep the resilience and the hopeful perspective in mind that we can pivot and shift, especially when we think about the global challenge of climate change. Because while climate change is one of the biggest threats to all of our livelihoods and the nutrition of the most vulnerable today, we again just can't stress enough, we have been working on resilience, climate resilience over the years, from predicting floods before they devastate communities to providing farmers with seeds that are heat and drought tolerant and pest resilient. So we've invested in this research and innovation early on, and we're already seeing how these investments strengthen communities' resilience to the mounting challenges of climate change. This work will take on a renewed importance and urgency as our global food system struggles to feed a growing population. And on the nutrition front, we risk losing an entire generation of children due to ongoing and compounded challenges of COVID, climate, and conflict. At the same time, we recognize that ag, especially in developed countries, contributes to climate change. And that's why we're helping farmers produce more with less, more nutritious food with less of an environmental footprint. That's possible in large part through the ingenuity of a lot of our partner universities, through the Feed the Future Innovation Labs, that are developing innovations like flood and drought resistant seeds and varietals resistant to pests and getting them in the hands of smallholder farmers. We're also working with local governments, civil society, and private sector to better manage climate risks through innovative disaster risk financing. And these investments now are helping farmers adapt to changing climate and are essential to laying the groundwork for a more resilient world. Happy to get into some exciting examples, but one of my favorite is through the investing in research with U.S. universities and partners to develop, over the last decade, to develop a variety of maize that's drought tolerant and able to adapt to conditions on the ground. And then when drought hit Southern Africa in 2016, 6 million farmers were able to plant this new seed and remain resilient. And across 13 countries, they grew enough to make 160 million more during the drought than if they had grown regular maize. So we need more types of interventions like this and innovations like this to help meet the challenge of climate change. But we know more still needs to be done. And we're hearing that loud and clear through our Global Food Security Strategy update. As you may know, we're updating the current strategy, which expires this year. And we've had an extensive consultation process, consulting more than 400 stakeholders from the field to our partners in Congress. Climate featured prominently across all of these discussions, and we're hearing resoundingly that addressing the immediate and long-term impacts of climate change underpins the achievement of our objectives and the ability of people, systems, countries, and communities to sustain development outcomes. And while climate change is by no means absent from the current GFSS, consulted stakeholders consistently encourage us in the Feed the Future Interagency to think bigger and more comprehensively about making climate change more prominent in the updated strategy. So I'm real excited. We're drafting the climate change strategy and doing the updated global food security strategy now, and welcome and encourage input from all of you to collect the best and biggest ideas to really meet the urgency of this time. I hope this is a start of a longer conversation, and turn back to Caitlin to hear from the rest of these great panelists. Over.
And thank you so much for that excellent survey of everything that's happening within USAID right now as it relates to climate change and food security. So just a couple questions for you before we move on to our next speaker. One is simply about the existence of your position within USAID right now. This is a new position. It didn't exist in prior administrations. So I think that in and of itself is evidence of attention to climate change. Can you speak to that briefly?
No, sure, thanks. I think it highlights the fact in the prioritization that the administration recognizes how much of an impact climate has on the sectors that are the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security has, so water, ag, and nutrition. So it's been a pretty exciting time and job to work on and help try to further elevate climate change in the Bureau. But I also have to say there's really been good climate work done throughout even the last couple years, and really good climate staff at USAID who have been diligently working on these issues. And now I think we're excited to sort of triple down on these efforts to be able to expand what we're doing and how we're doing it. And part of that is just, again, gearing up right now for the climate change strategy, which will start kicking off real soon, and get agency-wide input, and then again appreciate input from the broader community.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you again, Anne. We'll turn to you in a few minutes for some follow-up questions. At this point, though, I'd really like to turn to Zituni Old-Dada, Deputy Director of the UN FAO's Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity, and Environment. Zituni, over to you in London.
Well, thank you very much for this kind invitation. Very pleased to take part in this event and to listen to Anne and for all the progress that you mentioned. I'd just like to start by saying welcome back for the US. My colleague Vilmendra said the importance of political will in tackling the global challenge of climate change. But we also need leadership. And the US has been very active and leading on various areas, both within the negotiations and outside. And it does make a big difference. And I'm speaking as a previous climate change negotiator when I was working for the UK. And I very much appreciate the effort made by the US and throughout the collaboration, as I said, for the negotiations and outside. I mean, this is really timely, and especially when we saw the summit held by President Biden that really brought new energy, much needed for this climate change challenge, particularly that the Conference of the Parties from last year was postponed because of the pandemic, and many areas have been delayed. So we very much welcome really this initiative and bringing in not just government, but representatives from outside the government, you know, from non-state actors, as we call them, particularly from civil society and private sector. And this is what is really needed to make a difference, because we're all in the same boat. You know, this climate change concerns everyone. And you need this kind of event really to remind everyone of the challenge that we're facing and that we need to work together to achieve this. And the reason I'm saying this, just to finish, is that unfortunately we're lagging behind in addressing, you know, the big challenge of climate change. The science, the evidence is very clear that if we really want to avoid the danger of climate change, then we have 9 years basically to turn it around. And we need to raise our ambition and action to meet the global goal of staying below 2 degrees C and ideally 1.5 degrees C. At the moment, if you put all the effort from everyone around the world together, they take us just like a third of the way towards reaching this objective. So you can imagine the challenge that we're still facing, because we often underestimate really the effort that we need. So that's why the return of the US and this impetus, the new impetus, really is going to be very, very much appreciated and is much needed. And as far as FAO is concerned, that we're here to work with you and the colleagues and all other partners to bring in our knowledge, our expertise, and the ability to convene also various partners to address this. So we very much look forward to working with you towards COP26 and beyond. So thank you. Back to you, Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Zituni. Appreciate those remarks. I want to start with a few questions for you before we turn to Helga. I did mention at the outset a recent study done by FAO and partners that found it was the first ever study of contributions, not just of agriculture, but of food systems, generally speaking, to climate change. And it found that 34%, so over 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide are contributed through food systems. So I'm wondering, what do you think is the importance of these findings? What impact do you think this will have on the work that we do? Yep, over to you, Zituni. What do you think?
Thank you. I wasn't sure if you're addressing the question to me. Yes, indeed, this finding is very important. What it means is that agriculture is an important contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and therefore to climate change. And it is you know, one of the largest drivers to climate change and biodiversity loss. You know, we shouldn't forget about that either in terms of the impact of emissions. What this means also is that there are challenges, obviously, and opportunities that comes out of it. Challenges in the sense that what this shows is that the sector needs to be more efficient in the various stages of food production and processing and consumption to reduce this large amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So in terms of challenges. And the reason for this, as it was mentioned earlier, is that climate change does affect crop yields. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its report recently showed that when we look at global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, maize crop yield reductions would be around 10%. But if we look at the current trajectory of how we're doing to address climate change, these reductions would be around 20%. So there is a clear impact on food production and food security. And if we link this to the state of food security and nutrition around the world, and this is one of the flagship reports that FAO publishes every year, at the moment we have around 700 million people who go hungry. And climate change and conflicts have been identified as some of the key drivers to this hunger, who has been increasing throughout the last 4 years. So the cumulative effect, if you like, of changes in climate is already undermining all the dimensions of food security, including the availability of food, the access, the utilization, and the stability of food production. So this threat will continue unless we're able to reduce these emissions and to make sure that the sector adapts to the impact of climate change and become resilient to climate change. And if you look at the broader picture of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG 2 that deals with achieving zero hunger, obviously we're not going to be able to achieve this unless we address climate change, unless we fix the climate change problem and take really decisive actions on climate change. And also climate change cannot be addressed without managing agriculture and food systems and managing our natural resources. So this is what this means. And as my colleague Vimalendra mentioned earlier, the other impact of these emissions is on the quality, the nutritional quality of crops and plants, because these high levels or high levels of concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere affects the content of some nutrients such as iron and zinc in plants. It decreases this level in plants and therefore leads to deficiencies and undernutrition. Okay. So these are just some examples of some of the impact that what this means in terms of practice. And there are opportunities obviously associated with this. If we have time, I'll be happy to come back and elaborate on.
Thank you. That is something I'd like to come back to. And thank you for noting the impact of climate change on crop yields. I think as we both know, climate change affects all sectors of agriculture, farming, herding, forestry, and fisheries as well. So, but appreciate those remarks, and we'll certainly turn back to you for some follow-up questions as well. And with this, very pleased to turn over to Helga Flores Trejo, who is Vice President for Global Public Affairs and International Organizations at Bayer. Helga, over to you.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. Let me start by saying that at the outset, really, of the pandemic, it is clear that 2021 is a decisive year for climate action, and Situni and Anne have made this also very clear. Now, for me, it means also that 2021 needs to be the year that we show how agriculture is part of the solution towards climate change. And it's not always seen that way. But if you look at also at the White House Climate Summit, it was first really encouraging that it brought more speed and scale toward that climate action that we need. And second, it was also interesting that nature-based solutions were featured so prominently there. And this is why we also in Bayer focus our sustainability goals very much at the intersection of agriculture and climate change. So I thought I will give you two examples of agriculture as part of the solution and innovation towards resilience, and as part of the solution towards emissions reduction. Let me start by resilience. And here a disclaimer, I'm born in Mexico, so corn, for me is everything. And if we know exactly corn, there's approximately 1.1 billion metric tons growth corn globally every year. Now, in Bayer, we're developing a corn that is shorter, and therefore we call it short stature corn, that because it is shorter and more compact, it has proven to be much more resilient to winds and extreme weather patterns. I'm excited about it also because of being it more compact, it uses 20% less land for the same yield. Furthermore, because it grows deeper, the roots grow deeper into the ground, it has proven that it is more able to capture CO2 in soil and keep it there. And finally, what's really interesting is that it's better able to survive extreme droughts and use less water. So it is exactly this type of crops that we need in order to increase the resilience of farmers. And if you look, I think, Caitlin, you and I were talking before, if you look at some of the dramatic scenes from the Northern Triangle, where people are immigrating, and part of it, not all of it, but part of it is also the destruction of their livelihoods and the farms. I think this is the type of solutions that we need to make available. Second example, emissions reductions. This is also key, because we talk a lot about how agriculture accounts for a large part, almost 1/5 of the emissions globally. But here's what we're working on to capture emissions. Last year, we initiated a project in its first phase in the US and Brazil, working with 1,200 farmers and accounting for about 450,000 acres. What we are doing here is really supporting them to capture emissions by giving capacity building towards the climate smart practices, whether it's no-till or cover crops, and digital solutions. Furthermore, what Bayer will be doing is purchase or acquire the carbon captured here and do this at transparent prices. And the lessons that we are learning now of this first phase, the lessons, the learning, the feedback that we're getting will help us then scale up and bring it to other countries. Right now, we're doing it in Brazil and the US. For me, this was only possible because by now we are much better, both based on the science and based on the data, to clearly capture what is the carbon sequestered really by the crops and by agriculture, so we can account for them. And so it's also a result of that innovation in the data and science. The benefits are clear, right? It's not only the solution to capture carbon, but it generates a revenue for farmers, a new revenue, and furthermore, through the practices that we're talking about, it helps also improve soil conditions, improve management of erosion, etc. So these are two examples on how agriculture is being part of the solution and what we're working on. And it's clear for me that the magnitude of the change we need to achieve in agriculture cannot be done alone. And that's why I'm really grateful to you, to CSIS, and certainly of being here with FAO and with USAID, because we need everybody. We need everybody on board to have the impact we want.
Thank you so much, Helga. That was a fantastic overview, and I really appreciate the specific examples. That's one thing that we lose out by not being able to travel and see these things with our own eyes is hearing about these specific examples. So thank you for that. would like to ask you one quick question. I believe that Bayer did make a commitment as part of the Leader Summit on Climate at the end of last month. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Well, I think it's part of these efforts of advancing nature-based solutions. It was announced a new coalition that I'm also very excited about, because it's a public-private cooperation. It's the LEAF coalition, the Lowering Emissions by Accelerating Forest Finance. Here's what's interesting about it. That it is a coalition for the first time of bringing together governments, the UK, US, and Norway, with companies, initially 9 companies. We have committed that we will mobilize $1 billion towards forest finance. And the whole idea is really to help accelerate forest protection. We know this is also one of the most effective ways to reduce, to tackle climate change. And the interesting things, if I might say, Kathleen, is it will take these kinds of new ways of working together, of thinking about how we bring everybody to the table and how the private sector needs to be part of the financing of these solutions and the solutions themselves. So that's why I was very happy that we're part of this coalition.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do right now is bring all the panelists to the virtual stage for a quick conversation amongst us before we turn to the audience for questions. And would like to invite Anne, Zituni, Helga, is there anything that you would like to add based on the remarks that you heard from each other? Anne, are you reaching for the mute button?
I am reaching for the mute button. I just really appreciated some of the concrete examples on how we can both do mitigation and adaptation efforts. And there's huge opportunities on that. We talk about food loss and waste, et cetera. And one of the things we're doing at AID right now that I thought might be interesting to the audience and those our panelists is mainstreaming climate across everything we do. So not just in ag, where we have heavy focus and lots of research and great programming in the field on this, but even in our water sector, where we've been doing things like developing mainstreaming field toolkit for the field, which requires activities to apply standard indicators on programming we're doing right now, where it's appropriate, so that we can actually count some of the mitigation efforts that we're doing. So for example, we're helping countries build solar powered water systems that could be used for irrigation and just also used by communities. We're also encouraging folks to start counting the results, both for improved wash access, as well as climate change objectives. So I think the dual use, that's again a wash example, but that we're also doing climate change, but to think about how we can do this across all sectors. And so we can start counting and having a good baseline on what we then need to increase and move forward with also. But the importance of the dual benefits is huge. So really appreciated the examples from there. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. Zituni or Helga, anything to add?
Yeah, thank you. If I may just add to what Helga said with regard to nature-based solutions, and I totally agree that agriculture is very much part of the solution. Nature-based solution, just one example. And the reason I want to mention that is to put it in the overall context of reducing emissions from agriculture and food systems in general. And this is because when we look at nature-based solutions in general, they have a potential of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by a third by 2030. So you can imagine, as soon as we increase really the action in reducing emissions from the sectors, that would be the benefits. And when we talk about nature-based solution, basically we're talking about agricultural practices that are aimed at restoring and sustainably managing and conserving agroecosystems. And this includes, soil carbon sequestration, reduction of emissions from livestock, food loss and waste, restoring biodiversity, etc. So I just want to mention this and put it in context. So obviously FAO is doing, a lot of work in this area, supporting countries, including smallholder farmers, to benefit from climate smart agriculture practices, and also sharing of experiences between communities and between farmers, and to make sure that, you know, these solutions reach as many people as possible to help address climate change, but other challenges, you know, facing the rural communities in particular.
Thank you, Zitouni. Helga, any additional comments from you?
No, not for the moment, Caitlin.
Good, thank you. Well, one thing I'd like to do before we turn to audience questions is to ask Zitouni and Helga to answer the question that Anne answered, which is, do you think that this is a new era for climate change and food security? Zitouni, what do you think?
I wouldn't say it's a new era. I think it's been going for a while. There've been so many efforts happening. We've been slow, basically. So I wouldn't define it as a new era, because the facts are clear, and the challenges are very clear. And what we need to do is very clear. We just need to get on and do it. We need political will, absolutely. We need the participation of everyone, not just private companies, but everyone. And this is the main point I want to make, is that, you know, climate change concerns everyone. We shouldn't just look at it as a responsibility of government or private sector or innovation. Everyone has a bit to do, and we all have to look at our lifestyle and our consumption patterns, our diet, you know, how we use energy, how we use transport, natural resources in general, and just see what we can do as individuals to take just small actions to make a difference, basically. And that's really the main point. Thank you.
Good. Helga, what do you think?
Well, let me say this, Caitlin. We better make it a different era, meaning it has to be about action. Stop talk. It's really about now the impact. Zitouni mentioned it. We have 9 years. So we don't have the time. So we better make really the decisive time for us.
Okay, good. Great answer. Thank you. So turning to some questions from the audience, one line of questions that I'm seeing has to do with the differential impacts of climate change in different regions around the world. So some regions are experiencing temperature rises to different extents than others. Some regions are experiencing increases in precipitation, others decreases. So how, you know, from your individual perspectives, how are you tailoring solutions, including using very location-specific data to help producers reduce emissions and to help producers adapt to climate change? So I guess the question is, can you give some examples? And this is for Anne, Zitouni, and Helga, whoever would like to answer it first. How are you tailoring solutions at various local levels?
I could jump in. We've got climate information, getting it in a way that smallholder farmers and producers can use it is incredibly important to deal with climate change. This is one of the biggest challenges. And when you look at adaptation, it's hard to adapt if you don't know what's coming down the pike. So USAID has for years a long-term partnership with NASA called SERVIR, that has helping people in more than 45 countries access and use satellite imagery and climate and weather information to make better decisions on the ground about development, including ag. So it's really helpful, obviously, in the ag space. And we've got 7 hubs across the world that partner with regional technical institutions. So we're also building the capacity of local partners and to help integrate science into useful products. Again, not just numbers, but like, how do we use this information to better prepare for where there might be water for pastoralists to be able to bring their cattle so that they don't lose cattle, and can continue to be able to live and do pastoralist activities. But it's helping bring better decisions about livelihoods, disasters, because you can also do for flash floods and floods and longer term weather events. So it's pretty exciting. It's really needed, and helping update and ensure that especially smallholder farmers have digital access to this type of information, so they can also just use it and plan, is really helpful and empowering to people around the world. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Anne. Zitouni or Helga?
Yes, I mean, definitely. the solutions, they have to be tailored at the local level. Obviously, we can't assume that just one solution is going to resolve all the issues that are in the regions or in particular countries or under certain circumstances. It has to be tailored to what the local circumstances are facing. And here, you have to look at the climate change in the local context. Is it an issue of capacity? Is it an issue of availability of water? Is it an issue of access to information? Is it an issue of indigenous people and maintaining indigenous practices? And that's really key. Obviously, climate change affects everyone, but affects people in different ways. That there are areas where we thought we never have droughts, and suddenly you started to experience droughts. And other areas we never thought we'll have floods, including in the US and south of France, etc., that happened recently. So we have to look at the reality on how things are evolving with regard to the impact of climate change. Wherever tools and knowledge and policies we need to put in place, we need to tailor them to the local context, absolutely, and make the most of the local knowledge as well. But here, unfortunately, there are challenges because not everyone has access to information, technology, and innovation. And in order to look at the local context, there are certain things that can make a big difference to the local context. I'll give you an example. If we look at smallholder farmers in certain areas where having access just to mobile phone, for instance, can make a big difference in at least having information for local condition in terms of weather, but also access to markets, price of commodities, etc. And that can make a big difference. So we definitely have to look at the local context. We have to plan globally, if you like, but the action has to happen at the local level to make a big difference. Action at the global level, of course, in terms of setting political direction, etc. But at the local level, it has to happen and to take into account the local circumstances and realities.
Sure. Thank you, Zitouni. Helga?
Maybe just to add one aspect, because I think Anna and Zitouni mentioned the key, added to being able to tailor to the local situation and concrete country and challenge. I think it's key also that we provide comprehensive solutions. And this is what we're doing. In Bayer, we said we have a target that by 2030, we will support 100 million smallholders globally. And what we know is that by working with smallholders, if you tackle just one thing, right, access to inputs, but they have no access to finance, then you're still having a big problem. So what we are doing in our flagship, if you will, approach is the Better Life Farming Coalition, where we work with IFC to provide capacity on capacity building, on financing, with off-takers and with other partners on the ground, so that the smallholders receive not only access to the technology, as Zitouni was mentioned, but also access to the market through off-takers, access to finance through local banking, etc. And I think being local and comprehensive in these solutions is what will make the difference.
Sure, Anne, go ahead.
I just wanted to second that and thought that is a really good definition of resilience. I mean, it's a kind of a wonky term, but layering in different services and protections and opportunities for smallholder farmers, pastoralists, and just thinking about, insurance can serve a useful model also. And then we've done some interesting studies out of UC Davis through the Feed the Future Innovation Labs that looked at using drought resilient seeds, and when layered in with different types of insurance, made farmers so much more resilient during some droughts. One intervention isn't how we can address the complex threats that we're facing anymore, and especially those being compounded by climate change. So getting creative and thinking holistically about how these things fit together is an exciting policy challenge, but needs this different partnerships that Helga was just talking about, that we need to find different expertise to find solutions.
Thank you, Anne. Much of our conversation has focused on how to reduce emissions from agricultural production when we're producing more, or helping producers adapt as they're producing more. But of course, there are significant amounts of greenhouse gases emitted for food that ultimately isn't used because it's lost or wasted. And just wondering if one or a few of you could speak to efforts that that your organizations are making to address food loss and waste, because it's very strongly related to climate change. And you want to go ahead?
Yes, you might start perhaps.
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Yep.
Definitely, food loss and waste is a big problem, but it can be resolved fairly easily. And you mentioned in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, food loss and waste accounts for around 8% of global emissions. And we say actually that if food loss and waste were a country, it would be the third emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not something to underestimate, and the gains would be enormous. So we have to make all the efforts we can actually to reduce food loss and waste. And this comes back to the point I was saying earlier, that as citizens, as individuals, we are also responsible. And it's individuals who can actually take really a big action to look at our connection with food. And why do we throw food away? You know, we throw the third of the food that is produced for food consumption, for human consumption, away. And with that goes the energy and water and nutrients and everything that goes with it. What we encourage countries is obviously to have strategies to address this problem involving consumers and civil society and others. But to give you some examples, there are some countries who put this into law. They put this into law so that supermarkets will not be allowed to throw food away, and instead they build alliances with charities so that they can collect the food and bring it to the people who need it. And this is a really practical example that works, and it should be adopted everywhere, because we're still throwing so much food. And again, our connection with food is somehow lost. You know, we don't think about the real value of food, and that's why we throw lots of food away. So again, as you said, it's a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. It's a big problem, especially when you look at the other side of the spectrum, when we have around 700 million people who go hungry every day. And then we have around 2 billion people who eat too much and they're obese or underweight. And then we throw a third of our food away. So the food system it needs a lot of fixing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Zitouni. Helga, and any comments from you? If not, okay, good. Thank you. Looking at the Q&A from the audience, the questions from the audience, I'm also seeing several questions about the fisheries sector. When we talk about climate change and food security, people very often, very quickly go to land-based agriculture, but just wondering if anyone has comments to make on impacts of climate change on fisheries. And then just a quick note then, since we're coming to time, I'll go to each of you for final comments. But first, the question on fisheries.
We do some real neat work with the Feed the Future. We have an innovation lab for fish and fisheries, and can follow up with more information on that. I love the food loss and waste comments and conversation before, so I may jump on that question if that's okay, because as we talk about food loss and waste, if you look and break down on where the waste is, it's in developed countries. Where the losses are very much in the developing countries. And that can directly, if we can fix that, and especially help with storage and the transportation of food from farm to market, can really address some nutritional challenges. So that's something that we're looking into with the Center for Nutrition, because the gaps that you can fill by getting food into bellies is also have the adaptation benefits of dealing and then also there's mitigation benefits of not contributing to loss. So it's a pretty exciting dual win that I think we need to explore more, and there's a lot of energy in the US too. So it's one of these exciting things that crosses both domestic and international concerns, even though the problem is a little bit different in different countries, but something I think collectively, I really appreciate the comments earlier that we could work on together is pretty exciting. And that's one of the things that we just need to deal with some of these problems, but I'll stop.
Yeah.
So you want to move on.
That's great. Thank you, Anne. And some, like the World Bank, are doing great work looking at how these problems are manifest in different countries, different regions in different countries, because it's very different everywhere. So, but thank you for that comment. I appreciate that. Any comments on any additional comments on the fisheries questions from either panelist? Great. And if not, then I'd like to turn to our guest today for any closing remarks. We'll turn to Zituni, Helga, and then to Anne. So before we close, Zituni, final comments for the audience.
Final comment for me is I hope this has been useful. I hope people picked up something new that we can all act on. We can realize that actually this is for concerns all of us. My main message is to think about how we can change our mindset, to rethink of our responsibility, not just to wait for others to do things for us, to set up strategies and put things in place. Let's think for us as individuals and citizens on what we can do and take responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zituni. Helga.
Caitlin, maybe sometimes there's some that might be skeptical about the private sector. So let me tell you why it's important that we're part of this, and it's all about the impact. If you look at the emissions reductions commitment of Walmart, for example, they committed to reduce 1 billion metric tons by 2030. Now, this is comparable to what the whole of the EU has committed to, Walmart. Bayer, to give an example from our side, we have seen that in our business, we touch or have influence to about 1/4 of the global supply chain of agriculture. And that means that we can make a contribution that it's comparable to what India can make regarding climate change. So for me, it's all about the tremendous impact. And I can only finalize by saying and thanking you for bringing the different stakeholders together, because we really need to act now, act boldly, and act together. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Helga. And Anne.
I can't say much more than Helga. That was great, exciting. But I can say the U.S. political will is back. I mean, we're building off of a really strong foundation of good climate work and food security work that's been done over the last decade plus, and we're hopeful that we can address the climate crisis. We're excited that, and speaking of whole of society sort of approach, that we'll have an engagement process for drafting the climate change strategy. So we'll be soliciting comments and want some of these big and bold ideas that have been shared today, and looking forward to partnering with folks to move forward so we can address this challenge moving forward. Thanks, over.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you everybody else for joining us today. I'd like to again thank our distinguished panelists for being with us. I'd like to again thank FAO's Liaison Office and Office for North America for their partnership in today's event. And I'd like to thank the CSIS Global Food Security Team, Eilish Zimbilci and Eliza Lauter, and the CSIS External Relations Team for producing today's event. And again, I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in. Clearly there was significant energy, obviously not just in the political realm and the private sector and among multilateral organizations, but within our audience. So thank you very much to the audience for tuning in and for your excellent questions. Please visit us at csis.org for more information, and please follow us at on Twitter at CSISFood. And again, thank you.